Early January 1945, the war in Western Europe was entering its last brutal stretch, but the most dangerous front inside the Allied camp was not a river line or a forest road. It was a table, a chair, a stack of papers, and a single man in the middle of two nations that could not afford to break apart. Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Northwest Europe, was carrying a crisis that could not be solved with artillery. He had to keep an alliance from tearing itself open while the enemy still had teeth. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this, where the real battles are not only fought with rifles, but with pride, politics, and the fragile trust that decides whether wars are won or lost. The winter sky over Europe was the color of steel, and the Allied armies were still recovering from the shock of the Ardennes offensive, the German gamble that the world would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. The German blow had ripped a temporary bulge into the Allied line and forced commanders into emergency decisions, improvised coordination, and hurried transfers of authority just to keep the front from cracking. It had been a crisis of movement and logistics, of roads jammed with fuel trucks, of infantry digging into frozen ground while armored units searched for traction on icy slopes. It had also been a crisis of command, because the German thrust had split the American front in the north from the rest of the American system of control. There was a moment when speed mattered more than pride, and Eisenhower did what coalition commanders do when the alternative is disaster. He made a practical decision that was supposed to be temporary. He placed the American armies under the operational control of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British 21st Army Group, the 1st Army under General Courtney Hodges, and the 9th Army under General William Simpson, together numbering hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, would be coordinated from Montgomery's headquarters, because Montgomery was physically closer to the northern sector and could move decisions through his staff faster while the situation was in flux. Eisenhower saw it as a short bridge across the gap in the front. Montgomery saw something else. He saw proof. He saw leverage. And, most dangerously, he saw a stage. Montgomery had always understood war as performance as well as calculation. He believed in set-piece operations planned in detail, in deliberate timetables, in carefully constructed narratives that framed his role as the center of order inside chaos. During the crisis, Montgomery did his job. He coordinated the northern side, stabilized lines, and helped integrate the patchwork of units into something coherent. But when the immediate danger began to recede, he did not simply return to the original arrangement as if it had been a wartime necessity. That had passed. He began to act as if the emergency authority had revealed a permanent truth about how the coalition should be run. The first explosion came in a room of microphones and notebooks, not in a trench. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery stood before reporters and spoke about the Battle of the Bulge in a way that made American blood boil. He implied that he had found American forces in disarray and reorganized them, that he had taken a chaotic situation and brought professional leadership. That British direction had saved the day. Whether he intended to insult every American commander or simply could not resist placing himself at the center, the effect was the same. His words landed like a slap. To American ears, he was not praising cooperation. He was claiming credit. He was suggesting that American generals had panicked, that American leadership had been rescued by British competence, and that the victory belonged to him. The reaction was immediate, loud, and dangerous. American newspapers framed it as a theft of glory. Veterans and civic groups demanded explanations. But the real danger was inside the Allied command structure, where pride and authority were not decorations, but operating tools. General Omar Bradley, who commanded an American Army group and had been central to American operations since the Normandy landings, told Eisenhower that he would resign rather than continue under a command climate that allowed such public humiliation. Bradley was not a man who threw tantrums for theater. When he spoke of resignation, he was expressing something Eisenhower could not ignore. The command system itself was at risk. A coalition cannot function if the senior commanders believe they are being politically undermined by a partner with a microphone. The anger was not only professional, it was personal. American soldiers had been the ones freezing in the Ardennes, absorbing the violence of the German push, enduring the shelling, the ambushes, the sudden disappearances of men who never came back. Many units had fought for villages that turned into names on casualty lists, for crossroads that existed only because someone drew them on a map. When Montgomery spoke as if he had saved them from their own confusion, it felt to many like a second attack, not by German forces, but from an ally dismissing their sacrifice. There are insults that do not die because they are spoken into the wrong wound. This was one of them. Eisenhower understood the stakes with a clarity that made him tired to the bone. He could not treat this as a public relations problem. If American commanders lost faith in the coalition structure, the operational machine could stall. If senior American leaders resigned, the shock would ripple down through staffs and corps, into divisions and regiments, until the entire apparatus of cooperation became poisoned. At the same time, he could not simply destroy Montgomery. Montgomery was not an independent officer. He was Britain's most famous field marshal, a symbol of British military standing, a figure with political backing at home, and a man whose removal could be interpreted as an American takeover of the alliance. At the very moment when unity mattered most, Eisenhower did what he often did when the problem was too sharp for a direct strike. He prepared. He drafted relief orders. He created the mechanism to remove Montgomery if the damage could not be contained. He did not want to fire him, but he needed the option. Then another British figure stepped in, not out of loyalty to Montgomery's ego, but out of fear of the consequences. Lieutenant General Freddie D. Gingen, Montgomery's chief of staff, traveled to Eisenhower's headquarters, listened, and understood how close his commander was to catastrophe. D. Gingen returned to Montgomery and forced him to write an apology on January 8th. Montgomery apologized. It was a public retreat, but not a surrender of character. He apologized because he had to, because the alternative was the end of his career and a rupture in coalition leadership. The apology prevented immediate removal. It did not restore trust. American commanders did not suddenly believe Montgomery had changed. They believed he had been cornered. And then, when a wise man would have gone quiet and rebuilt bridges, Montgomery pushed for more. In the days that followed, the coalition moved from anger to negotiation. Montgomery met Eisenhower at Allied headquarters and presented his case for the future. He argued that the Allied strategy should shift away from a broad front advance and instead concentrate power in the north for a decisive thrust into Germany. In his vision, a unified command under his direction would drive toward the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, and end the war by late spring. He framed it as military logic, as efficiency, as the natural conclusion of what the Bulge had supposedly proven. But the proposal was not just about maps. It was about control. Montgomery wanted the First Army and the Ninth Army to remain under him permanently, not as a temporary emergency measure, but as the core of his offensive power. Eisenhower listened without interruption. He understood the argument. He also understood the man making it. Montgomery's method was set-piece warfare, deliberate and highly organized, built for carefully arranged assaults where the enemy is pressured into collapse. By overwhelming preparation, American commanders, particularly the aggressive ones, favored speed and exploitation, turning openings into breakthroughs before the enemy could recover. In a coalition, there's room for both styles, but there is no room for a style that comes attached to political possession of another nation's armies. Eisenhower's response was direct. The command arrangement during the Ardennes crisis had been temporary. The American armies would return to American command. Montgomery's expression hardened. He believed Eisenhower was making a military mistake for political reasons. Eisenhower, in turn, believed Montgomery was making a political demand disguised as military logic. The difference between the two perspectives was the difference between coalition survival and coalition fracture. Bradley's position was not negotiable. He had commanded these armies across France. They were American forces. He would not serve as an army group commander with his armies detached and placed permanently under a British commander who had just publicly humiliated American leadership. Bradley's threat to resign was more than pride. It was a declaration that the American command structure would not tolerate permanent subordination. Eisenhower also knew that Bradley did not stand alone. Other American commanders saw the situation the same way, and the more flamboyant ones were even more volatile. George Patton, commander of the Third Army, heard of Montgomery's demand and said he would resign alongside Bradley. Patton was not subtle, and he was not politically cautious. He had just executed one of the most dramatic operational turns of the war, pivoting his army in winter conditions and driving to relieve Bastogne. For him, Montgomery's press conference had already crossed the line. Montgomery's demand to keep American armies permanently was, in Patton's mind, an attempt to chain American blood to British reputation. Patton did not view it as a debate among gentlemen. He viewed it as theft, a slow theft conducted with paperwork and phrases about unity. The threat of losing both Bradley and Patton was not a manageable inconvenience. It was a potential collapse of the American command structure in Europe. If senior American leaders resigned en masse, it would shake confidence at every level. It would also create political chaos back home, where American public opinion could turn against any arrangement that appeared to place American forces under foreign command. Eisenhower faced a nightmare, not simply angry generals, but a coalition crisis that could jeopardize the war's final months. This was exactly the kind of fracture Winston Churchill feared. Churchill understood that a coalition is not only armies moving in parallel, it is also national pride, political survival, and the delicate balance of influence. Britain had been at war for years. Its forces were experienced and exhausted, its manpower strained, its economy battered. The United States had arrived later with vast resources and growing dominance. Churchill knew that if Britain lost influence over Allied strategy, the final victory would become almost entirely American in direction and credit. He also knew that if Britain fought too hard for influence, it could shatter unity and create a scandal that Britain could not afford. Churchill contacted Eisenhower and proposed a compromise: return the First Army to Bradley, but allow Montgomery to keep the Ninth Army for the Rhine crossing. That way, Montgomery would have enough American mass to conduct the Great River Assault, preserving a measure of British strategic relevance, while American commanders regained most of their forces and their dignity. Eisenhower accepted the compromise framework because he needed a bridge. He needed to avoid a resignation crisis, avoid humiliating Britain, and still keep Montgomery from turning emergency authority into permanent possession. But Eisenhower added a clause that Churchill did not fully spell out, a restriction that mattered more than all the polite language around it. Montgomery could keep the Ninth Army only temporarily and only for one mission: the crossing of the Rhine. After that, the Ninth Army would return to American command. No permanent authority, no continuing control. One American army for one operation. Eisenhower understood that if he left the timeline vague, Montgomery would treat vagueness as opportunity. Montgomery asked when the Ninth Army would return after the crossing. Eisenhower said it would be determined by operational circumstances, but it would return. Montgomery protested that planning required stable force structure. Eisenhower repeated that the decision was final. Montgomery understood the choice: accept the reduced compromise or lose everything immediately, and be left commanding only British and Canadian forces for the rest of the war. He accepted. On January 17, 1945, the First Army officially returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. General Hodges now reported to Bradley again. The command structure returned to what it had been before the Ardennes crisis, and the principle that American armies would be commanded by Americans was re-established. Bradley was satisfied with that portion, but he remained suspicious. He believed Montgomery would attempt to extend his control over the Ninth Army beyond the Rhine crossing by turning every subsequent operation into a reason to delay the return. Bradley warned Eisenhower to watch Montgomery carefully. Eisenhower assured him that the agreement would be honored. Then the war moved forward, and the next test came in the form of a river. The Rhine was not just a geographic obstacle, it was a symbol. For years, it had been part of the mental boundary of Germany, a line of defense and identity. To cross it in force meant that the Allies had entered the heart of the enemy's homeland. The Germans understood its significance. The Allies did as well. The crossing would be massive, dangerous, and logistically complex. Montgomery, the master of set-piece warfare, threw himself into planning Operation Plunder as if it were the culmination of his method. He built an operation that emphasized meticulous preparation, artillery schedules, supply dumps, engineering plans, bridge construction under fire, airborne drops to seize key ground beyond the river. It would be a spectacle of organization, a giant machine designed to crush resistance by weight and timing. Simpson's Ninth Army worked closely with Montgomery's staff. Simpson respected Montgomery's organizational skill and his attention to detail. The planning was thorough. Few details were left to chance, but American officers noticed something that sharpened Bradley's fears. Montgomery's staff spoke about the future beyond the Rhine as if the Ninth Army would remain a permanent part of the British 21st Army Group. Planning maps and operational discussions included the Ninth Army in movements deeper into northern Germany without clear acknowledgement that the Army was supposed to return to American command after the crossing. It was subtle, but it was consistent. The Ninth Army was treated as if it belonged. Eisenhower understood the danger, but he also understood timing. A commander cannot change a complex operation on the eve of execution without risking confusion and delay. He chose to let the operation proceed, then settle the command question once the river was crossed. That was the gamble. Allow Montgomery to have his set-piece crossing with one American army, then enforce the return as promised. Before Montgomery could present his crossing as the definitive symbol of professional planning, another American commander created a competing symbol overnight. On March 22, 1945, Patton's Third Army reached the Rhine near Oppenheim. The Germans were weakening, their lines thinning, their ability to respond collapsing under constant pressure and loss of resources. Patton saw an opening, a section of river that could be crossed quickly before the enemy could reinforce. He did not wait for weeks of preparation. He acted. Within hours, elements of the Third Army were across the Rhine. Patton immediately called Bradley and told him, with characteristic bluntness, to tell the world they were across. He wanted the world to know the Third Army had made it before Montgomery began his engines. Patton's crossing was not only a tactical success, it was a statement about doctrine. It was American mobile warfare in its purest form: speed, aggression, exploitation of weakness, and the belief that boldness can reduce casualties by preventing the enemy from organizing effective resistance. Montgomery heard the news and was furious. To him, Patton's action was reckless, a gamble that had succeeded because the Germans were too weak to punish it. He insisted that the Rhine required proper preparation, that the true crossing would be plunder, a professionally planned assault that guaranteed success and minimized risk. Montgomery's narrative was clear. Patton had been lucky. Montgomery would be correct. But in the political war inside the alliance, the damage was done. Patton had proven something Montgomery did not want proven. The Rhine could be crossed. Without Montgomery's elaborate set-piece machinery, the river was formidable, but it was not magic. It could be taken with opportunism if conditions allowed. Patton had crossed first. The warrior had beaten the politician by a day, and that fact would echo in American minds. Operation Plunder launched on March 23, 1945. It was enormous, a combined assault involving British, Canadian, and American forces, with massive artillery support and airborne operations designed to seize critical points behind the German lines. Engineers built bridges under fire. Units crossed in assault boats and tracked vehicles. The operation succeeded, and Montgomery declared it a complete success, a showcase of careful planning. The Brent had expanded. The northern route into Germany was open. Simpson's Ninth Army performed excellently, and American troops did much of the hard fighting inside the operation, Montgomery would claim. As proof of his method, American newspapers noted the contrast. Patton had crossed first, with fewer layers of preparation, and had done so rapidly. Plunder was impressive, but it was not the first crossing. It came after Patton had already made the Rhine something that could be taken. With the river behind them, the coalition moved into the final stage of the war. German resistance was still real, still deadly, but it was increasingly brittle, cracking under relentless pressure from multiple directions. The question that returned, as Bradley had predicted, was command. After the crossing, Montgomery's staff submitted operational plans for advancing into northern Germany. That included the Ninth Army as if it were still under British command indefinitely. Montgomery argued that removing the Ninth Army at that moment would disrupt ongoing operations. He claimed that unity of command was essential for the encirclement and destruction of remaining German forces in the north and the Ruhr region. He framed the return of the army to American command as militarily foolish in the middle of active operations. To Americans, it sounded like the strategy they had feared: turn every operation into a reason to delay the return, then turn the delay into a new normal. It was a familiar pattern in coalition politics. Necessity becomes habit, habit becomes entitlement, entitlement becomes a claim of right. Bradley pressed Eisenhower. Montgomery had been given his Rhine crossing. The agreement had been fulfilled. Now the Ninth Army must return as promised. Eisenhower saw that Patton had predicted correctly. Montgomery was using operational arguments to extend his control. Eisenhower also understood something else. If he allowed Montgomery to keep the Ninth Army beyond the agreed operation, even under the banner of necessity, he would reignite the resignation crisis. Bradley would not accept it. Patton would not accept it. Other American commanders would view it as betrayal. The alliance would bleed trust until it collapsed. Eisenhower decided the moment had come to enforce the agreement. On April 4, 1945, the Ninth Army officially returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. The transfer was final. Montgomery protested and appealed upward, arguing that the army was essential for continued operations in the North. He protested to Churchill, framing the decision as militarily unsound. But Churchill did not intervene. The political cost of fighting this battle was too high, and Britain's influence over Allied strategy had been declining since the Normandy campaign. The war was approaching its end, and Churchill could not afford a coalition crisis now, not when the defeat of Germany was in sight. The return of the Ninth Army was more than a staff change. It was a statement of principle. American armies would be commanded by Americans. Emergency arrangements could exist, but they would not become permanent structures of control. That principle mattered because coalition warfare is built on consent and trust cannot survive if one partner believes its blood is being used as a bargaining chip. Simpson's Ninth Army continued, advancing into Germany under American direction and played its part in the final victory, moving eastward until Allied forces linked with Soviet forces at the Elbe later in April. The army Montgomery had desperately wanted to keep ultimately did what it had been created to do: fight and win under its national command structure, integrated into a coalition but not possessed by it. Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced into northern Germany and the Netherlands with British and Canadian forces, liberating populations, capturing ports, and accepting surrender in its sector in early May. But Montgomery was commanding only Commonwealth forces. His larger vision, a great northern thrust under his banner toward Berlin with American mass as his driving engine, had died months earlier in a press room and then at a negotiation table. This is the part of the story that sounds like personality, but is actually strategy. Eisenhower's compromise was not simply a political patch. It was a controlled test. By giving Montgomery one American army temporarily, Eisenhower allowed Montgomery to run his preferred kind of operation, while keeping the coalition from exploding. It bought time, prevented mass resignations, and kept Britain from feeling publicly sidelined. But it also created a clear line: one army, one operation, then the return. That clarity was essential because Montgomery, as Bradley feared, would push as far as he could if given ambiguity. The gamble carried risk because Montgomery had a history that worried Americans. Months earlier, in September 1944, Montgomery's Operation Market Garden had failed. It had been ambitious, bold, and promoted with confidence, but it had ended with heavy losses and an objective that collapsed short of its promise. Montgomery had famously described that failure as 90% successful, a statement that many Americans saw as evidence that he could not admit error. Without rebranding it as partial triumph, he had faced no meaningful consequences, and that lack of consequence fed the perception that he moved through the war, protected by political status rather than held accountable by results. Now, after the Rhine crossing, Montgomery attempted to use success as a lever to keep what he had been given only temporarily. Eisenhower, by enforcing the return of the Ninth Army, drew the line the coalition needed. He also demonstrated something important about leadership in coalition war. A commander does not only manage battles, he manages egos, national pride, and the silent math of political legitimacy. Eisenhower could not command effectively if his American generals no longer believed he protected their authority. He also could not command effectively if Britain felt humiliated and pushed to the margins. His solution had to balance both, even if it pleased neither. Montgomery's press conference on January 7th did not merely offend. It changed the emotional climate of the alliance. Trust, once cracked, does not reseal quickly. Montgomery's apology prevented immediate catastrophe, but it did not erase what his words had revealed: that he viewed the coalition as a stage, and American armies as tools for his narrative. That perception hardened American resistance to any permanent command arrangement under him. When he demanded permanent control of the First and Ninth Armies, he was not simply asking for forces. He was asking for ownership of a story. And in coalition war, stories are power. The American commanders who threatened resignation were not simply defending ego. They were defending the principle that American political leadership and American public opinion would not accept American armies being permanently directed by a foreign commander, especially one who publicly implied American leadership was incompetent. In democracies, armies do not operate in a vacuum. They carry the weight of the society that funds them and mourns them. Eisenhower understood that if the American public concluded their sons were being used to prop up a foreign reputation, the political foundation of the entire effort could wobble. Churchill understood a different reality. Britain's influence was shrinking, and he could not allow it to vanish completely without consequence. Britain had been fighting since 1939, had endured the darkest years, and had produced symbols like Montgomery that helped maintain national morale. Churchill needed Britain to remain visibly relevant, not only for pride, but for political stability. But Churchill also understood that the United States had become the dominant power in the Western coalition, and that dominance could not be denied without provoking a rupture. His compromise was not an act of charity. It was an act of survival. There is a moment later in January that captured the shift in power, when Churchill spoke publicly and acknowledged that American forces had borne the largest share of fighting and losses in Northwest Europe. In earlier years, Britain had stood alone and carried the moral weight of resistance. Now the coalition had flipped, and Churchill had to navigate that reality with words that maintained partnership while admitting hierarchy. It was a humiliating pill in public terms, but it was also a pragmatic recognition that Britain could not dictate the final months of the war. For Montgomery, the crisis ended with a narrowing of his reach. He still commanded powerful forces, and he still played a central role in operations, but he no longer had the authority he wanted over American armies. The First Army returned to Bradley. The Ninth Army returned after plunder. And once those transfers happened, the path of coalition command became clearer. Americans would finish the war under American command structures, coordinating with allies, but not subordinated to a British field marshal's permanent authority. For Eisenhower, the crisis ended with something more valuable than a map victory. He had kept the alliance from eating itself before the war was won. He had prevented mass resignation. He had avoided a public humiliation of Britain. He had given Montgomery enough to conduct a major operation without allowing him to convert temporary necessity into permanent power. That is what made Eisenhower effective, not a genius of tactics in the way some battlefield commanders were, but a genius of coalition management under pressure, the kind of leadership that prevents political failure from turning into military disaster. For Bradley and Patton, the outcome reinforced a hard boundary. Their threat to resign had been a weapon, and it had worked because Eisenhower knew they were not bluffing. Bradley's authority was restored with the return of the First Army. Patton's aggressive doctrine gained an additional shine because of the timing of his Rhine crossing at Oppenheim, a crossing that undercut Montgomery's claim that only careful set-piece planning could break the river barrier. Patton had not only moved an army, he had moved the argument. When the war ended in May 1945, the alliance was still intact, still imperfect, still full of resentments and memories, but intact. Germany surrendered, and the coalition emerged victorious. Yet if you trace the line of Montgomery's lost ambition, you do not find it broken by German fire. You find it broken by a microphone and the reaction it triggered. Montgomery's vision of leading a grand thrust to Berlin under his own unified command died in January because he chose to speak as if the victory belonged to him, and because Eisenhower, balancing on the edge of alliance fracture, chose a compromise that gave Montgomery enough rope to reveal his intentions. Coalition warfare is not only about defeating the enemy, it is about managing partners who are strong enough to walk away. It requires humility from those who want credit, restraint from those who feel insulted, and a leader who understands that sometimes the most important battlefield is a room where men decide whether they still trust each other. Montgomery shattered trust with one press conference. Eisenhower contained the blast with one compromise. Montgomery tried to exploit that compromise. In the end, he lost the prize he wanted most, the right to command American armies as if they were his own. And that is why, in the final accounting, Montgomery's greatest defeat in the West was not a failed bridge at Arnhem or a stalled thrust on a road. It was a political defeat, a defeat of trust, delivered by his own words at the worst possible time.